So this question is from Michael. It says, I'm learning Hebrew by reading the Old Testament in the original. Much of what seems explicit in the King James Version is actually inferred and implicit in the Hebrew text. Is this a widespread characteristic of biblical Hebrew?
And Michael, I love this question. Like, really love it. And first, I want to give you big kudos for actually making the effort to learn Hebrew and study the Bible in Hebrew, because as you're seeing now, you're opening up a whole new world, which you don't get when you're reading the English verses. And it's not the fault of the English translators. It's just the natural result, the natural struggle of what's going to happen when you try to translate something from its original language into a new and different, uh, completely different language. And with language comes lots of context, with lots of history, lots of culture. And I had this big revelation when I studied Arabic for a summer, and I just realized, holy cow, that when I learned Arabic, I suddenly understood the Middle East a whole lot better, and the people and why they are, the way they act, the way they think, just by learning the language. And so it's the same way for Hebrew. To learn Hebrew, the language, you also have to learn Hebrew, the people, and their experiences, and what the world was like for them, and how did they view the world. And when you do that, you realize there's so much more to the words that are there than what we could ever possibly get in a very concise translation like we have. So, as you it suggests, there's implicit and explicit meanings. There's something that might be the obvious, straightforward meaning of it, but at the same time, the words might have these implicit, kind of hidden, not as clear meanings associated with them. And they're both there. And when the translators have to translate, they're just going to go with the most simple, most obvious meaning, usually, right? And of course, they'll look at the context, do their best to try to put it into English. The translators are doing amazing jobs when you actually think of the struggle that they go through to convey the meanings. I'm often very impressed. But let's look at a specific, without just being abstract. Let's look at a verse. Let's take a look at one of my favorite for this is Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And this is a verse which reads about how God formed man out of the dust of the ground and then breathed into him the breath of life. And when we just see it in English, we're like, what's going on? Oh, and by the way, and then it ends, and then the man became a living soul or creature, or the Hebrews could be nefesh. When we look at the original Hebrew, we see 3 times a word associated with breathing being used. And then we see 3 times a word associated with ground being used. And it's emphasizing something: breath, 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 ground, ground, ground. And so what are these words, especially the ground? Like, I see it says it formed Adam out of the ground, but where's the other grounds? Well, the Hebrew word for ground is Adema. The word for man is Adam. So God made Adam out of the Adama, out of the ground. And so right there, even just the name of man is closely associated with ground. And we miss that context. I was talking earlier about how man's domain is really the ground, the earth. That's where we are. And in a sense, we get a touch of the heavenly. We have a little bit of essence of the heavenly in us, which God does through breathing air into us. And then we're now breathing and connected and dependent on the air, and reminded of the heavenly realm, in a sense, by every breath we take. And going back to, and man became a living soul or living creature. That word there, nefesh, actually literally would mean like a living, breathing creature, a breathing creature. So that word is related to the words that when God breathed into Adam the breath of life, those are words that are related to then nephesh, the breathing creature word also. So 3 times breathing creature, 3 times ground. And so the Bible, the verse is emphasizing this again and again, and it gets lost when we just read the English. And is there any way to possibly translate that and bring that context into the English? Not without this explanation like I just gave. So I want to really applaud you, Michael, for learning the Hebrew, getting into it, and digging deeper. And I hope that all of you will challenge yourselves to do that, especially verses where you struggle. You're not getting the meaning. You look at the different translations; they seem to be all over the place. That's a great time to then really dig into the original Greek or original Hebrew, and your mind might just get blown about the possibilities of what all the words in that verse might be trying to say. Tina, Wendy, anything?
Yeah, no, I definitely commend our friend here for learning Hebrew. It's so beautiful. Like I don't speak Hebrew, in any way, shape, or form fluently, but I have used I'm sure so many of you out there, we always recommend this Blue Letter Bible where you can go and find you know, the original the Bible in its original language, either Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, and it gives you, a much richer and a deeper understanding of what that text is really saying. And so, yeah, no, I think Jay, you definitely hit the nail on the head exact as far as how it is a bit different, but um, in a way, I can't help but like think, when you're asking that a lot of things that are explicit in the King James is inferred in the Hebrew text, the people who translated it must have really understood kind of the culture and the nuances of these original languages to be able to translate it in such a way that it things had to be explicit. And it kind of reminds me of just how American culture is, just in the sense that our culture, because it's so new and it has such a variety of cultures in it, we really have to be very explicit. Whereas if you go to a culture that's been around forever, like you go to the Middle East and that culture has been around for thousands and thousands of years, it's such a richer and deeper culture because they've had the time to really develop implied things and things that don't need to be said because everybody understands the culture. And so,
And that's actually a really good point. A
yeah, and
super good point.
yeah, and I remember taking a class on this when I was a newlywed, because I realized I'd married into a different culture, and I was like, I really want to understand that. And that was basically the biggest take home from this class on culture and relationships, is just how when it's not easy to understand a culture, it's just, or what to do, then things just have to be super explicit. Like, um, for example, if you're going into certain Middle Eastern cultures, in American culture, if you offer something, you just say no thanks, and then it's done. That the exchange is over. But in other cultures, like certain Middle Eastern cultures, you offer and you have to say no. But that's not the end of the exchange. You understand that there's more to it. You have to offer at least 3 times, and then after 3 offers, if they really say no, no, I insist, no, then that actually means no. And so it's just kind of one of, I'm sure, hundreds of examples of different cultures out there where, yeah, like there's so many nuances, so many things that are only understood within that culture, within that context. And again, like that's the tough thing about English being a newer language, especially the modern English that we speak today. It just doesn't have that richness like the Hebrew does, which has been around forever. And so, yeah, I totally hear what you're saying.
Yeah, and I could give even an example of how meanings morphed over time, even within the Bible. So
Mm.
like, yeah, the
Mhm.
Old Testament. I mean, you're exactly right, Tina. A lot of words might start off potentially with a more clear, apparent meaning, but then over time morph as more and more meaning comes out of it. And it's more the implicit, explicit. I think more what rather you see is you have a literal meaning. So, for
Mhm.
example, you have a word for hot. someone's getting, this thing is hot. And then over
Mm,
time, someone says, I feel like when you get angry, you get hot. So then the word for hot, getting hot, becomes the word for also getting angry.
mhm.
And we see that in Hebrew. And then you take a word like nephesh, we were just talking about, which in
Mhm.
Genesis 1 is talking about a living, breathing creature. And over
Mm.
time, it begins to refer to a living person and to life itself. And then continue to morph into really talking about your essence, like, I love you with all my soul, talk about your, this deepest inner um, essence of who someone is, like almost like one's heart. And you see big gaps, for example, like between Moses's books, the Pentateuch, and then if you look at the books, let's say around the time of David and Solomon and them, there might be now different usages of the same words coming about as the language becomes more sophisticated, or these words develop secondary meanings. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
it's funny you talk about that too, because even in English language, our language has developed so much in the last, 100 years. And the thing is too, what we forget in language is we use so many things like that are figurative, like idioms. And you even kind of see them sometimes pop up in the Bible.
Mhm.
Like God says, that you're the apple of my eye. And that's not, that's an idiom, it's a phrase. And it doesn't literally mean that you are an apple that God puts in his eye, right? It's just like, we say things like, oh, it's raining cats and dogs now. There's so many,
Yep.
expressions that we have. And it's, I can't imagine the duty you would feel as a translator of the Bible, the most important book ever written, to make sure you convey the right message, because it's not always literal. Like what you're saying is not always a literal thing. Um, or you might be translating, a phrase that happened then that, so again, like their language is so deep and so um, meaningful, but also it can just be so complex. It's not just black and, it's not just always a straightforward thing. And so, yeah, I think that that's something we really have to, consider when we're thinking about the Bible, and every translation is,
Yeah.
basically what's the essence of the message being spoken of in that verse.
And what's
Yeah.
also really interesting is just how the Bible through the centuries has actually developed languages. Languages have had to be developed and modernized to even
Mm.
accommodate translations of the Bible. So Luther, as he's translating the Bible, is is stretching
Yeah,
German
that's right.
language to its limits. And coming up with new words, new combination of words that hadn't existed before. And then Tyndale, as he's working on the English translation, is working on his Bible that then becomes a big basis for the the King James version down the road. He also now, I think it was Tyndale, maybe it's the other guy, Wesley.
I'd
Sorry,
say
Wycliffe.
Wesley, yeah, maybe.
It was Wycliffe or Tyndale. He then again is coming up with new words that didn't exist, like Passover. He came up with the word Passover,
Mm.
scapegoats, all these things where there was no English equivalent whatsoever. And he's now creating words for the English language so that we can even translate and read and somewhat get a grip of what's being said there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You're right, because I mean, like in my background, like I study, semantics. Like that's a big part of what I do, and in my day job, because I wish I could just study the Bible for my job, but I have to pay bills, and so, but a big part of what I do is semantics and just understanding language, and really it's symbolic. So, how is it that you know you take the letter D-O-G, and then you make D-A-G. You make these three sounds, and immediately a picture pops into people's heads of a small furry animal, and it's just kind of like, it's a message that you're trying to convey, and so God is using what He can to convey the right message. And so, I think, when it comes to the Bible and, again, like translation, understanding God's word, it just always goes back to what is the essence, what is the message that God is trying to give to our world. And I think that's why we really have to just focus on that and not get so caught up in little technical things. Whereas, what is the basic message? And I think it's so awesome that when you look from Genesis to Revelation in the book of in the Bible, which was written by, 66 books, 40 authors across 3 continents over a span of 1,500 years. And yet there's one central thing, which that is Jesus, the Messiah, our Savior. And so the message that God is trying to tell to you is, God sent his only begotten son because he loves you and he wants to save you and he wants to rescue you from this world of sin. And so, as much as there's all these things, there is at the end of the day, there is a point, there is a very clear message that God is trying to say to his people. So I think that's cool too.